There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house at night, the kind that makes it feel safe to hear something true. So pull the blanket up, let your eyes go heavy, and stay with me for a little while. Tonight I want to tell you about something so small that almost no one thought to be afraid of it, and about how for most of human history, that small thing was one of the most dangerous forces on Earth. Here is the truth this story rests on. For nearly all of human history, the greatest danger a person faced was not a war or a famine or a wild animal in the dark. It was a scratch, a splinter, a pinprick from a needle, a nick from a kitchen knife, a scrape against a fence post. Something so minor that today we would barely notice it happening. And yet for thousands of years that small break in the skin could open a door that no one could see. A door that led slowly and quietly toward death. No one understood why. No one knew what was moving through the wound or how to stop it. A person could survive a fall from a horse, a difficult winter, a hard birth, and then die 3 days later from a splinter the length of a fingernail. Picture a farmhouse kitchen in rural Germany in the early 1800s. It is early autumn, and the light coming through the small window is the low gold of late afternoon. A young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, is peeling apples at the table, working quickly, because there is bread rising, and a fire that needs tending, and a dozen other things waiting for her hands. The knife slips just slightly and catches the side of her thumb. It is nothing. She barely stops what she is doing. She wipes the blood on her apron, presses her thumb against her palm for a moment, and goes back to the apples. By evening, she's forgotten it happened at all. 4 days later, that same thumb is swollen and hot to the touch, the skin around it tight and shining. She has a fever that will not break. Her mother, who has buried 2 children already, and knows the particular exhaustion in her daughter's face, sits beside the bed through the night, changing the cloth on her forehead, praying, waiting. There is no name yet for what is happening inside that small wound. There is no understanding that something invisible has entered her body through that thin break in the skin and is multiplying inside her faster than her body can fight it off. All anyone in that room knows is that a healthy young woman who was peeling apples 4 days ago is now fighting for her life because of a moment she does not even remember clearly. This was not a rare story. It was for most of history an almost ordinary one. What is strange when you sit with this for a while is how invisible the danger really was. A soldier going into battle understood in some bodily way that he might not come home. A sailor understood the sea could take him. But a farmer's daughter peeling apples in her own kitchen had no reason to feel afraid. The danger did not announce itself. It did not look like danger at all. And that is part of what makes this particular history so unsettling to sit with, and also strangely so human. Because if you had lived, then this would not have been someone else's story. It would very possibly have been yours or mine. There is something else worth sitting with here too. For centuries, people were not blind to what was happening. They watched wounds turn bad. They watched fevers rise. They buried people they loved from injuries that seemed on the surface so small. And they tried things. They packed wounds with honey, with moss, with wine, with ash from the fire. Some of these worked sometimes, though no one alive then could have told you why. They were reaching in the dark toward an answer that would not fully arrive for another 100 years. What we now understand about infection, about the invisible world living on every surface and every blade and every unwashed hand, was for most of human history simply unknowable. And yet people kept trying anyway, generation after generation, with nothing but observation and hope and whatever had worked or seemed to work the last time. Before we go further into that world, I want to ask something of you, if you do not mind. If this is the kind of history you come looking for, the real story told slowly and honestly, it helps enormously if you take a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps this kind of storytelling keep going. And if you have a moment, I would love to know in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what drew you to this particular story. I read every one, even the ones that come in at strange hours, which, given what this channel is for, is most of them. Now let's settle in properly and let the fire burn a little lower and go back to that world where a splinter could be the beginning of the end. Because the young woman peeling apples was not living in a world without medicine. Quite the opposite. She lived in a world with doctors, midwives, surgeons, apothecaries, healers, passed down through families for generations, entire traditions of care, stretching back to ancient Egypt and Greece and Rome. What she did not live in was a world that understood what was actually happening beneath her skin, and that gap between caring deeply for the sick and understanding almost nothing about why they became sick in the first place shaped nearly every wound, every birth, every small accident for thousands of years of human life. To understand how dangerous an ordinary day once was, we have to go back further still to the world that came before her, the world that built the customs and beliefs she inherited without ever questioning them because they were simply how life had always been. Go back far enough and you find a world that had already spent thousands of years trying to make sense of the body without ever being able to look inside it in any meaningful way. Not in the way we mean today. There were no microscopes strong enough to see what truly moved through blood and tissue, no understanding that the air itself, the water, the very hands that offered comfort could carry something dangerous and invisible from one person to another. What people had instead was observation patience, and centuries of guesswork passed down as certainty. In ancient Egypt, physicians were remarkably skilled with their hands. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Nile shows wounds that were cleaned bound and treated with substances we now know actually had some real effect. Honey among them, which modern chemistry has confirmed, does slow the growth of certain bacteria, drawing moisture out of a wound in a way that happens to be protective. The Egyptians did not know why honey worked. They only knew from generation after generation of trial that it often did. This is one of the strange and quietly moving threads that runs through this whole story. That long before anyone understood infection, ordinary healers were stumbling into real answers through nothing but careful repetition and memory. The Greeks built on this in their own way. Physicians in the tradition of Hippocrates working several centuries before the Common Era developed careful systems for wound care, believing that pus in certain forms was a sign the body was healing itself, a concept they called laudable pus. It sounds almost gentle, doesn't it? Laudable, as though the body were being praised for its effort. In some cases they were not entirely wrong, since a wound draining and clearing itself out can be part of a healthy process. But the same belief carried forward uncritically for well over 1,000 years later became one of the most dangerous ideas in the history of medicine, because physicians in later centuries came to actively welcome the presence of pus in a wound, sometimes even encouraging it, mistaking a sign of serious infection for a sign of healing. This is the strange inheritance that the young woman from our story and millions like her carried without ever choosing it. A patchwork of true observations and false conclusions stitched together over centuries by people who wanted sincerely to help. By the medieval period in Europe, the picture had become even more layered and in some ways more confused. The dominant medical framework of the time rested on the idea of 4 bodily humours: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and the belief that illness came from an imbalance among them. A wound was not seen primarily as an opening through which something dangerous might enter. It was seen as disruption of internal balance, something to be corrected through bleeding, purging, or careful attention to diet and environment. Surgeons, who at this time were often barbers as much as physicians, worked with instruments that were rarely if ever cleaned between patients, not out of carelessness exactly, but because the entire concept of an invisible contaminant simply did not exist yet in anyone's understanding of the world. There is a detail here that surprises most people the first time they hear it. In many medieval and early modern hospitals, the same knife might be used to lance a boiler cyst in an amputation and then help deliver a child all within the same day, with nothing more than a wipe on an apron between uses. It was not recklessness. It was simply the accepted shape of medical practice built on a genuine belief system that had no room in it for germs, because germs as a concept would not exist for the medical world for several hundred years more. What people did notice again and again across cultures and centuries was a pattern they could not fully explain. Wounds treated in certain environments tended to heal. Wounds treated in others tended to fester and turn fatal. Battlefield surgeons noticed that wounds cleaned with wine or vinegar sometimes did better than wounds left untreated. Midwives in some regions noticed that births attended with clean linen seemed to go better than those without. These were not scientific conclusions in the way we would understand them now. They were folk patterns passed down as instinct and superstition as much as knowledge, because no one yet had the tools to ask the deeper question of why. Scholars still debate how much of this early observational wisdom was genuinely understood by the people practicing it, and how much was accidental, the byproduct of habits that happened to work for reasons no one at the time could have articulated. What the evidence does show fairly clearly is that human beings have always been noticing the edges of this problem circling it, sensing that something was there long before anyone could name it. There is something worth sitting with in this, something almost tender if you let yourself feel it. For thousands of years, people cared for each other's wounds with real devotion, real skill in some ways, and almost no true understanding of the actual danger they were working against. A mother cleaning her child's scraped knee with water from the well, a ship's surgeon packing a sailor's leg wound with whatever was on hand during a long voyage, a village healer boiling herbs because her mother had boiled the same herbs and her mother before her, all of them working in the dark against an enemy they could not see, using tools built more from inherited habit than from any real comprehension of what infection actually was. An infection, once it took hold, did not discriminate by class or by wealth in the way one might expect. A king's physician had access to more remedies, more attention, more careful nursing certainly, but wealth could not purchase an understanding that simply did not exist yet anywhere in the world. In this one narrow and terrible way, the splinter in a farmer's hand and the wound of a nobleman were for most of history equally mysterious, equally dangerous, and equally beyond anyone's real control. It's worth pausing here on something easy to miss. We tend to imagine the deep past as a place of constant visible danger, wars and famines and disasters, the kind of history that announces itself loudly. But the danger this story is built around was almost entirely silent. It moved through daily life disguised as nothing at all, hidden inside the most unremarkable moments a person could imagine. A scraped palm, a bitten lip, a needle prick while mending a shirt by candlelight. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the more unsettling truths about how fragile ordinary life once was. Not fragile because the world was cruel in any dramatic sense, but fragile because an entire category of danger existed that no one could see, name, or defend against. And yet threaded through all of this uncertainty, there were people scattered across centuries and continents who kept noticing things, who kept asking in their own limited way why some wounds healed and others did not, who kept trying substances and discarding what failed and remembering what worked even without knowing why. That thread of observation, faint and inconsistent as it was, never quite disappeared. It survived in monasteries where monks copied down herbal remedies. It survived in the kitchens of women who passed down wound care knowledge as carefully as recipes. And slowly, without anyone realizing it at the time, that thread was quietly gathering toward something. It would take many more centuries and a great deal more suffering in Kyrgyzstan before anyone began to understand what was actually happening beneath the skin of a wound. But the people living inside that uncertainty were not passive. They were paying closer attention than we often give them credit for, working with the only tools available to them, which were their eyes, their memory, and their willingness to try again after loss. Think for a moment about the hands that built the world you know. Not metaphorically, but literally. The actual hands, calloused and scarred, that shaped wood into furniture, iron into tools and leather into shoes in workshops and barns and smithies across every century before our own. These were the hands most exposed to the danger this story is built around, because certain kinds of work simply placed a person closer to the edge of that invisible door than others. Consider the blacksmith first, since his trade carries a particular kind of irony worth sitting with. Here is a man working constantly with fire, with heat capable of purifying metal, and yet almost nothing about his daily routine protected him from the danger inside his own wounds. A spark lands on bare skin and is brushed away without a thought. A sliver of hot metal thrown loose during hammering embeds itself in the forearm and is plucked out with fingers blackened from the forge. The heat that shaped his iron did nothing to shape his understanding of what might now be living inside that small wound carried in on the same soot and grit that covered his hands from morning until night. Blacksmiths, in fact, appear again and again in old parish records, with injuries that seem almost absurdly minor by today's standards, listed beside a burial date only weeks later. The carpenter faced a different, quieter version of the same danger. Splinters were simply a fact of daily life for anyone working wood by hand, so common that most carpenters barely registered them as injuries at all. And this is precisely what made them so dangerous. A splinter driven deep under a fingernail or lodged along the side of a palm was the kind of wound easiest to ignore, easiest to leave untreated because it seemed almost too small to matter. There is a particular cruelty in this pattern if you sit with it long enough, that the wounds most likely to be dismissed were often exactly the ones most likely to fester unseen, working their way deeper into the body, while the person who carried them went on about their week, certain it was nothing. The farmer's dangers were perhaps the most varied of all, because farm life placed the body in constant contact with soil, with manure, with the teeth and hooves of animals, all of it teeming with the kind of invisible threat that no one at the time had any way of naming. A scratch from a rusted plough blade, a kick from a mule that broke the skin along the shin, a puncture wound from a pitchfork driven half an inch into the foot through a worn leather boot. Soil in particular carried a danger that historians and medical researchers have only fully understood in more recent centuries, since certain organisms living in dirt and manure are especially effective at causing the kind of deep, fast-moving infection that could take hold within a matter of days. A farmer wounded by his own tools was, without knowing, wounded by one of the most dangerous environments a person could be injured in. The butcher's trade carried its own particular weight of risk, working as he did with blades in near constant use, cutting through flesh and bone for hours at a time, his hands slick and often numb with cold. A slipped knife was common enough that most butchers carried old scars across their palms and fingers, as simply part of the job, the same way a farmer carried sunburn or a fisherman carried salt-cracked skin. What made the butcher's wounds particularly dangerous, though something few people think about even now, is that he was cutting not only into his own flesh when the blade slipped, but doing so in an environment already saturated with the raw material of animal death, blood and tissue and bacteria from carcasses hanging only feet away. A cut received in a butcher's shop entered the body already surrounded by exactly the kind of contamination that made infection more likely, though of course no one working there had any concept of contamination in the way we understand it now. Fishermen carried a version of this danger out onto open water, far from any help if something went wrong. A hook driven through the webbing of a hand while baiting a line. A gash from a knife used to clean fish slick with scales, and the cold brine of the sea. Salt water, interestingly, was sometimes credited with a kind of protective effect, and there is some truth buried in that old belief, since certain concentrations of salt can slow the growth of some harmful organisms. But salt water offered no real protection against the deeper, more aggressive infections that could take hold in a puncture wound, and a fisherman injured several days from shore with nothing more than what he carried in a small kit. Below decks faced one of the more isolated versions of this danger, entirely dependent on his own body's ability to fight off something no one on that boat could see or name. Even the shepherd, whose work seems on the surface gentler than the others, carried real risk in the quiet repetition of his days. Working constantly among sheep meant working constantly among the particular bacteria those animals carried, some of which scholars still debate the full historical scope of. This may have contributed to certain wound infections that were simply recorded in old parish and manor records as fever or as a wasting sickness without any more specific cause given. A shepherd bitten by a dog protecting the flock or gored lightly by a ram during shearing season faced the same silent gamble as everyone else in this story. An ordinary injury from an ordinary day with no way of knowing whether his body would fight it off or not. What ties all of these lives together across such different trades and different corners of the world is not simply that injury was common. Injury has always been common in every century in every kind of work. What made this particular period of history so quietly dangerous is that there was no meaningful gap between an injury and a potential death sentence. Today, a carpenter who drives a splinter under his fingernail thinks nothing of it. He may not even clean it particularly carefully. His body, supported by modern hygiene and by medicine that did not exist for nearly the entirety of human history, handles the danger so efficiently that the danger has become invisible to us in an entirely different way. Invisible because it has been almost entirely defeated. For the carpenter working in 17th century rural France or 18th century rural England, that same splinter carried real weight, a small and genuine possibility that this week's minor injury would become the reason his family buried him before the season changed. There is a pattern historians have noted in parish burial records across several centuries of rural Europe, a pattern that becomes visible only when you read enough of them in sequence. Deaths among working adults, particularly men in trades involving blades, tools and animals, spike in certain seasons, often in warmer months, when wounds were more likely to be exposed when work was more intensive and when the environment itself, warm and often unsanitary by any modern standard, gave whatever was living in soil and dust every advantage it needed. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how many of these deaths trace back to what we would now call sepsis or gangrene. Since the language used at the time was so different from ours, words like putrid fever or mortification standing in for a mechanism no one could yet describe with any precision. But the pattern itself, working adults dying suddenly in the weeks following what should have been survivable injury, appears again and again across regions and centuries with a consistency that is hard to read as coincidence. What strikes me most sitting with all of this is how ordinary the danger truly was. This was not a story about war or plague or famine, the kinds of catastrophe history usually remembers. This was a danger woven into the most unremarkable moments of daily labour, into the very work that fed families, built homes, and clothed communities. The blacksmith did not fear his forge. The farmer did not fear his field. And yet, in a very real sense, they should have, not because the work itself was cruel, but because their own bodies, capable and strong as they were, had no real defence against what might slip in through the smallest opening in the skin. And there was one group in particular whose exposure to this danger was even more constant, more intimate, and in some ways more devastating than any of the trades we have just walked through. A group whose ordinary work brought them face to face with this invisible threat. Not occasionally, but as a routine and expected part of caring for the people they loved most. There is a kind of courage that rarely gets remembered as courage at all, simply because it happened so often in so many homes that it came to seem like nothing more than the ordinary shape of a woman's life. Bringing a child into the world was for most of human history one of the most dangerous acts a person could undertake, and the danger did not end the moment the child took its first breath. It often began there. A mother in labour was, in the plainest possible terms, someone with an open wound the size of nothing else in human experience, a wound that no blacksmith's burn or farmer's puncture could compare to in scale or vulnerability. And she faced this wound not once but potentially many times across her life in a bedroom or a farmhouse or a cramped city tenement attended by a midwife whose hands, however skilled and however loving, had likely gone from one birth to another, one household to another, without any concept that something might be travelling between them. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reshapes how we should picture the danger we have been walking through so far. A blacksmith might injure himself once a month, if that. A mother in the weeks following childbirth was living inside a period of sustained vulnerability that could stretch on for days, her body working to heal from the inside in a way that made her far more exposed than a scraped hand or a splintered palm ever could be. The illness that could follow, when it did follow, has gone by many names throughout history. Physicians and midwives once called it childbed fever, a term that sounds almost gentle now the way laudable pus once did, but which describes something that could take a healthy young mother from apparent recovery to death within a matter of days. Here is a detail that surprises most people the first time they hear it, and it is one of the more unsettling threads in this entire story. In many of the great lying-in hospitals of Europe, built specifically to help mothers deliver their children safely, the rate of childbed fever was often far higher than among women who gave birth at home with no formal medical attendant at all. This seems on its face almost impossible. Why would a hospital staffed by trained physicians be more than once dangerous than a farmhouse bedroom attended only by a neighbour or a village midwife? The answer, though, no one at the time understood. It had everything to do with exactly the pattern we have been tracing through this whole story so far, an invisible danger being carried unknowingly from one patient to the next on the hands and instruments of the very people trying to help. In some of these hospitals, physicians moved directly from performing autopsies in the morning to assisting births in the same afternoon, washing their hands if they washed them at all, only with plain water, sometimes not even that. The idea that anything might be carried on the skin itself, invisible and undetectable, simply did not exist within the medical understanding of the time. A physician's hands were considered clean if they appeared clean. Nothing more was thought to be necessary, because nothing more was yet known to be necessary. The evidence surviving from this period remains difficult to interpret with full precision, since record-keeping varied enormously between hospitals' regions and decades, and mortality figures were not always tracked with the consistency we would expect today. What does survive, though, in hospital ledgers and physicians' own private notes is a pattern striking enough that a few careful observers of the era could not help but notice it themselves, long before anyone had language to explain what they were seeing. There is something quietly devastating in imagining what that pattern must have felt like from the inside for the women living through it. A mother arriving at one of these hospitals in the final days of pregnancy, frightened perhaps, but trusting that she was placing herself somewhere safer than she could manage alone, giving birth, holding her child for the first time exhausted and relieved, and then within a day or two the fever beginning quiet at first, then rising, the same fever that had taken so many women in the beds around her in the weeks before. Midwives and nurses in these wards grew to recognize the signs with a kind of grim familiarity, a particular smell, a particular colour to the skin, a particular restlessness in a patient's eyes that seasoned attendants came to associate without understanding why with the days that followed. Mothers were not passive in the face of this danger. though history rarely credits them with the awareness they actually carried. Many women of the era, particularly those who had already lost a friend or a sister to childbed fever, developed their own informal understanding of risk long before physicians did. Some requested attendants who had not recently handled other cases of the illness. Some insisted on specific linens, specific herbs burned in the room, specific rituals passed down through generations of women that, whatever their scientific basis or lack of one, at least gave these mothers some sense of agency inside a danger they could not see or name. And here too, folk knowledge occasionally brushed up against something true in the same quiet, accidental way we have seen throughout this story. In certain regions, midwives developed a practice of washing their hands in vinegar or in water infused with certain herbs between deliveries, not because they understood infection in any modern sense, but because tradition passed down through generations of careful observation suggested it seemed to help. Scholars still debate how widespread these practices actually were and how much of their apparent effectiveness can be attributed to genuine antimicrobial properties versus simple coincidence and selective memory. But the pattern of ordinary people circling toward real answers, generations before science, could confirm them appears here just as clearly as it did in the wound care traditions of ancient Egypt. What makes this particular thread of the story so heavy to sit with is not simply the scale of loss, though the scale was real and significant. It is the intimacy of it. A blacksmith's death from a wound was a private tragedy within his household. A mother's death from childbed fever was often witnessed directly by other mothers lying in adjacent beds, women who had just given birth themselves and who now understood with a clarity no one wanted exactly what might be coming for them next. Is it any wonder that some women of this era approached childbirth not simply with the ordinary fear of pain, but with a deeper, quieter fear of what might follow in the days after, once the child was already safely in their arms? There is a particular kind of grief embedded in old family records from this period that is easy to miss unless you are looking for it directly. Genealogists who study parish registers across several centuries of European history have noted a recurring pattern: men who appear in the records as having married 2, sometimes 3 different wives across their lifetime, each marriage ending, not in the wife's old age, but in her 20s or 30s, often within weeks of a birth recorded in the same register. These were not unusual or scandalous family histories. They were in many communities simply what an ordinary family history looked like, a pattern so common that it rarely drew particular comment at the time. However extraordinary it appears to us now looking back with the benefit of everything we have since learned. What strikes me most working through all of this is how much quiet trust these mothers placed in the people caring for them, trust that was almost never betrayed by malice or carelessness in any personal sense. The midwives, the physicians, the family members holding us mother's hand through those difficult days wanted as much as anyone in this story so far to help. The danger did not come from a lack of care. It came from an absence of understanding so total that even the most devoted attendant in the room was, without knowing it, sometimes part of the very mechanism that put the mother at risk. This same invisible mechanism, the one moving quietly between patients, between wards, between one delivery and the next, was about to be noticed for the first time in any rigorous way, not by a philosopher or an ancient healer working from inherited tradition, but by a young physician working inside one of those very hospitals, a man who would begin asking a question so simple and so uncomfortable that it would eventually cost him almost everything to keep asking it. That thread of accumulated household wisdom quietly reaching toward an answer no one could yet prove deserves a closer look before we go further, because it is easy to imagine the people living through this world as simply helpless in the face of danger they could not name. They were not. They were remarkably resourceful, working with the only laboratory available to them, which was memory itself, passed down through countless small trials across countless households, refined slowly over generations the way a river shapes a stone. Step for a moment into a modest home in 17th century England, the kind of household where the woman of the house served as the primary source of medical care for her entire family, as women in nearly every culture and era have done. She keeps what is often called a still room, a small space set aside for preparing remedies lined with jars and pouches and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. This is not a place of superstition alone, though superstition certainly lived alongside genuine skill within it. It is a place of accumulated, careful observation refined and adjusted across generations of mothers and grandmothers, each one adding what she had learned to what she had been taught. Honey appears again and again across nearly every culture that has left written or archaeological records behind, and we touched briefly on this earlier, but there is more worth knowing here. Beyond ancient Egypt, honey shows up in wound treatments across medieval Europe, in traditional Chinese medicine, in the household remedies of colonial households in North America. Modern research has confirmed something remarkable about why this worked so consistently across such different cultures with no contact between them. Honey draws moisture out of a wound through simple chemistry, creating an environment where many harmful organisms struggle to survive, and certain types of honey also produce small amounts of hydrogen peroxide as natural byproduct, giving it a genuine, measurable antimicrobial effect. None of the women applying honey to a child's scraped knee understood any of this. They only knew from watching their own mothers and from watching what happened when they tried it themselves that it seemed to help more often than not. Perhaps even more surprising is the way mouldy bread appears in wound care traditions, stretching from ancient Serbia to World War-era Russia centuries before anyone understood what mold actually was. In some regions, healers packed wounds directly with bread that had been deliberately left to grow mold or applied a paste made from mouldy grain. It sounds almost unsettling to modern ears, doesn't it? The idea of pressing something spoiled and grown over directly into an open injury. And yet, we now know that certain molds produce natural compounds that suppress the growth of bacteria, the very same principle discovered independently and by accident many centuries later, that would eventually lead to one of the most important medical breakthroughs of the modern era. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how widespread or consistent this particular practice was across different regions, since so much of this knowledge passed through oral tradition rather than written record, but enough scattered references survive across enough disconnected cultures to suggest something real was being noticed again and again by people with no way of explaining what they had found. Wine and vinegar held a particular place of trust among battlefield healers and household caregivers alike. Used to rinse wounds before binding them, a practice that stretches back at least to the writings of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, and continues in various forms well into the modern era. The mild acidity in both substances does have some genuine effect against certain organisms, though nowhere near reliable enough to explain on its own why some wounds treated this way healed, while others treated identically still failed. Copper too appears in wound treatments across ancient Egyptian, Aztec, and Phoenician medical traditions, sometimes applied directly as filings or dissolved into water used for rinsing, and modern research has confirmed that copper does have measurable antimicrobial properties. Though the ancient healers using it were working entirely from observed outcome, never from any understanding of the mechanism underneath. What is easy to miss sitting comfortably in a world where we understand the actual chemistry behind all of this is how much genuine intelligence went into these home remedies even without any scientific framework to support it. This was not blind superstition passed along carelessly. It was careful generational pattern recognition, refined the way any skill is refined through repetition, failure, and adjustment. A mother who tried 3 different treatments across 3 different injuries in her household and noticed which one seemed to work best was practicing a rough, intuitive form of the same principle that would later become the foundation of modern clinical research, simply without the language or the tools to formalize it. Not every remedy trusted by ordinary households held up under later scrutiny, and it is worth being honest about that too, since the story loses its truth if we only tell the parts that turned out to be right. Some treatments spiderwebs pressed into wounds. Certain animal fats ash mixed directly into open cuts likely did more harm than good, introducing additional contamination into a wound that might otherwise have healed on its own. Scholars still debate how to weigh the overall balance of folk wound care across history, since for every remedy modern science has since validated there are others that almost certainly worked against the very recovery they were meant to support. The households using these remedies had no reliable way to distinguish between the two. They were guessing carefully and lovingly, but guessing nonetheless. There is something quietly moving in imagining how much of this knowledge simply vanished, carried only in memory, never written down, lost the moment a particular grandmother or midwife or village healer died, without passing it fully along to the next generation. For every remedy that survived long enough to eventually be studied and understood, how many others, some perhaps genuinely effective, disappeared entirely, taking their small, hard-won wisdom with them? And all of this, the honey, the mouldy bread, the vinegar and copper, and careful household trial and error, was still circling the same unanswered question that had shadowed every part of this story so far. Not what helps a wound heal once trouble has already begun, but why some wounds turn dangerous in the first place and others, treated no differently, simply did not. That deeper question would not be answered in a still room or a farmhouse kitchen or a village healer's careful hands. It would take a very particular kind of stubbornness and a willingness to look at uncomfortable evidence that almost no one else wanted to see, before anyone began to understand what was actually happening and where precisely it was coming from. There is a particular kind of dread that surgeons of the 18th and early 19th centuries came to know intimately, a dread that had nothing to do with the surgery itself. The cutting, however brutal it sounds to modern ears, was often the least dangerous part of what a patient faced. What came after in the days and weeks following an operation was where the real danger lived, waiting quietly in the very walls of the hospital meant to help them heal. Surgeons of this era operated with genuine skill and in many cases remarkable speed, a skill born of pure necessity in a world without anesthesia as we understand it today. A surgeon named Robert Liston, working in London in the 1830s and 40s, became famous and somewhat legendary among his own colleagues for his ability to complete a leg amputation in under 30 seconds, a speed that sounds almost impossible until you understand why it mattered so much. Every second a patient remained conscious on the table was a second of unbearable pain and the very real risk of the patient going into shock from the trauma alone. Speed in this context was not showmanship, it was mercy of a rough and desperate kind. But here is the detail that surprises most people the first time they hear it. And it sits at the very centre of everything this story has been circling. The operation itself, however swift and skillful, was often the safest moment in a patient's entire ordeal. It was what happened afterward in the ward, in the bed, in the days that followed, that most often determined whether that patient walked out of the hospital or was carried out of it. Hospitals of this period, particularly the large surgical hospitals of European cities, developed a reputation among the surgeons who worked in them that would sound almost unbelievable if it were not so thoroughly documented. Physicians of the time had a name for the particular danger that seemed to live inside these buildings themselves, calling it hospital disease or sometimes hospitalism, a term that captured something they could sense clearly but could not yet explain. Patients admitted for what should have been minor survivable procedures, a broken bone set, a small tumour removed, a wound cleaned and stitched, would frequently develop fever. then swelling, then a particular greyish, foul-smelling discharge from the surgical site that every experienced surgeon of the era learned to recognise with something close to despair. Gangrene, when it took hold in a hospital ward, could move from a single patient to several others in the same room within days, though no one at the time understood how or why certain wards seemed to suffer far worse than others. The evidence surviving from hospital records of this period, particularly in major surgical hospitals in Paris, London, and Vienna, suggests mortality rates following even routine amputations that are difficult to comprehend by modern standards in some documented periods, climbing well above 1 in 3 patients, and in the worst wards during the worst seasons considerably higher than that. Scholars still debate exactly how consistent these figures were across different hospitals and different decades, since record keeping varied enormously, and some hospitals had strong incentives not to document their failures too precisely. But the broad pattern that a hospital, the very place built to heal, could in this era be more dangerous to a patient than the injury that brought them there in the first place, is supported by enough independent sources to be considered reliable. What made this particular horror so difficult for surgeons of the time to address was that they were in nearly every sense working blind. The instruments used across multiple surgeries in a single day were wiped at best on an apron already stiffened with the blood of previous patients. Many surgeons of considerable skill and reputation took a certain pride in the state of that apron, wearing it almost as a badge of experience, the way a butcher or a blacksmith might wear the marks of a long career. The idea that this same apron or these same unwashed hands might be carrying something directly into the next patient's open wound simply did not exist as a concept anyone could reach for. Surgical wards were often kept in conditions that strike a modern listener as almost impossible to imagine. Straw bedding changed infrequently, air thick with the smell of previous patients. Windows sometimes kept deliberately shut in the belief that fresh air itself might weaken a recovering patient. There is a particular irony buried in the surgical theatres of this era that is worth sitting with for a moment. These operating rooms were often designed with tiered seating, allowing medical students and sometimes even paying members of the public to observe surgery as a kind of demonstration, even a form of public spectacle. A crowded gallery of onlookers, none of whom had scrubbed or covered themselves in any way, breathing directly down onto an open surgical wound below, was considered entirely unremarkable, simply part of how surgical education and even public curiosity functioned at the time. We now understand, with the benefit of everything discovered since, that a crowded, unclean gallery leaning over an open wound was very possibly contributing directly to the very infections that so baffled the surgeons working below them. Soldiers wounded in battle during this same general period faced perhaps the most concentrated version of this danger anywhere in society. Military field hospitals operating under conditions of chaos, limited supplies and overwhelming numbers of wounded. Arriving at once saw infection rates that were, if anything, even more severe than those in civilian hospitals. A soldier who survived a musket ball to the leg, who endured the amputation that so often followed such an injury, still faced weeks of genuine uncertainty afterward. Uncertainty that had nothing to do with the battle he had already survived, and everything to do with an enemy no one in that field hospital could see or fight directly. And yet even within this grim picture, a handful of sharp-eyed observers scattered across different hospitals and different decades could not help but notice something that did not sit right with them. Why did some surgeons working in the same building using broadly similar techniques see dramatically different outcomes among their patients? Why did certain wards seem to suffer far worse than others, even when the patients arriving in each seemed on the surface no different from one another? Why did outcomes sometimes shift for reasons no one could explain simply based on which physician had been the last to examine a patient before labour or before surgery? These were not questions anyone had the tools to fully answer yet, but they were being asked quietly by a small number of physicians who found themselves unable to simply accept hospital disease as an unavoidable fact of nature, the way most of their colleagues did. This kind of noticing the willingness to sit with an uncomfortable pattern rather than explain it away has always been rarer than we might like to believe in any era. Most physicians of this period, capable and dedicated as many of them were, had been trained within a framework that left little room for questioning the basic assumptions of their profession. If a patient died of hospital disease, it was generally understood as an unfortunate but expected part of surgery itself, an act of fate or constitution rather than something that might be traced back to a specific correctable cause. To suggest otherwise, to suggest that the physicians and surgeons themselves might be inadvertently responsible for the very deaths they were mourning, was not simply a scientific claim. It was in the social and professional world of the time close to an accusation, one that very few people were prepared to make and even fewer were prepared to hear. It is worth pausing here to sit with the sheer emotional weight this must have placed on the surgeons and physicians who were beginning in whatever small and uncertain way to suspect the truth. Imagine believing even faintly, even without proof, that your own hands, the very instrument of your calling, might be part of what was killing the people you devoted your life to saving. That is not a comfortable thought to carry into a ward each morning. Most physicians of the era, understandably, did not carry it, but a few did, and it changed everything about how they approached their work. One physician in particular, working in a large maternity hospital in Central Europe during this period, would soon find himself unable to look away from exactly this pattern drawn by a set of numbers in his own hospital's records that simply refused to make sense under any explanation his colleagues offered him. What he noticed, and what he eventually dared to suggest as the cause, would place him directly at odds with nearly the entire medical establishment of his time, and the story of what happened to him afterward remains one of the most quietly tragic chapters in the whole history we have been tracing tonight. There is a particular arc that infection follows once it takes hold, a pattern so consistent across centuries and continents that physicians eventually gave it stages names, even long before they understood the mechanism driving them. It is worth walking through this arc slowly and honestly, not to dwell in darkness for its own sake, but because understanding it is the only way to understand what so many ordinary families actually lived through, and how quietly, how gradually, an entire household could move from routine to catastrophe. It begins almost always the same way. A wound that seemed minor enough to ignore, or was ignored simply because there was no reason yet to think otherwise. The first day passes without much notice. Perhaps some soreness easily attributed to the work itself to a long day to nothing in particular. By the second or third day, something shifts. The skin around the wound grows warm, then hot, tightening in a way that makes the surrounding area feel strange under one's own touch, unfamiliar in a body that has known itself for decades. A dull ache begins to spread outward from the original injury, no longer confined to the small point where the skin was broken. This is the stage that old family letters and physicians' private notebooks from the period describe it again and again in language that varies by region and era, but circles the same observations. A fever that comes on gradually, then climbs. A restlessness that keeps the person turning in bed, unable to find comfort in any position. A particular kind of exhaustion that settles over them, heavier than ordinary tiredness. The body's early signal, though, no one at the time understood it this way, that it has begun fighting a battle it may not win. By the fourth or fifth day, in the cases that turned genuinely severe, the wound itself would often begin to change in ways that frightened even the most experienced caregivers in the household. The skin around it could darken, sometimes taking on a mottled, almost bruised appearance that had nothing to do with any new injury. A smell distinct and unmistakable to anyone who had encountered it before would sometimes begin to rise from the wound itself, a smell that village healers and family members alike learned, through grim repetition to recognize as a particular kind of warning. Historical medical writing from across Europe and colonial North of America describes this smell with a consistency that suggests it was one of the most universally recognized and universally feared signs of the era, regardless of language or region. What makes this progression so quietly devastating to sit with more than any single detail within it is how ordinary the setting almost always was. This was not in most cases happening in a hospital ward surrounded by physicians who at least understood, however imperfectly, what they were looking at. It was happening in a bedroom above a kitchen, in a loft above a barn, in the same bed where a person had slept every night of their adult life, surrounded by people who loved them completely and understood almost nothing about what was actually unfolding inside their body. A husband sitting beside his wife's bed, wringing out cloths, soaked in cool water, murmuring reassurances he did not entirely believe himself. A mother keeping vigil over a child's swollen hand, changing the dressing every few hours because it seemed like the only thing left within her power to do. There is a particular kind of helplessness in this that is difficult to fully convey, because we live now in a world where this specific helplessness has become almost impossible to imagine. Today, if a wound begins to show these signs, there is a clear and immediate path forward medication that can be administered within hours, a course of treatment with a name and a known outcome. For most of human history, there was no such path. There was only watching, waiting, and hoping that the person's own body would somehow win a battle that no one in the room could see being fought. Physicians of the era, when they were called at all, often arrived only after the illness had progressed significantly, since travel took time, and many families first exhausted every home remedy they knew before seeking outside help. What a physician could offer once he did arrive was frequently limited to observation, to confirming what the family already feared, and in some cases to procedures that we now understand likely did far more harm than good. Bloodletting remained a common response to fever well into the middle of the 19th century, in many regions, based on the old belief that illness reflected an imbalance requiring correction. A patient already fighting a severe infection, already weakened and fevered, would sometimes be deliberately bled further, a treatment that, however sincerely offered, worked directly against the very recovery it was meant to support. The evidence surviving from this period in physicians' casebooks and in family letters preserved in historical archives suggests considerable variation in how different individuals responded once infection reached this stage. Some, for reasons medicine still does not fully understand even today, recovered on their own, their bodies somehow overcoming an infection that by every outward sign appeared severe. Others, with wounds that had seemed at first no more serious, declined steadily and did not recover at all. Scholars and medical historians still debate how much of this variation came down to the specific organism involved, how much to the individual's overall health and nutrition at the time of injury, and how much remains even now simply unexplained. This inconsistency, cruel as it must have felt to families living through it, was itself part of what made the danger so difficult to understand or predict. There was no reliable warning to distinguish a wound that would heal from one that would not until the body itself began to answer that question on its own. What survives most clearly in the written record from this period more than clinical detail is the sheer weight of waiting that families carried. A letter from a woman in rural Massachusetts in the early 1800s writing to her sister about her husband's infected hand following a farming accident describes days that, blurred together, marked only by whether the fever seemed slightly better or slightly worse than the day before. There is no dramatic turning point in her account, no single moment of crisis. Only the slow accumulation of small observations, a little more colour in his face this morning, a little less appetite this evening, each one weighed carefully against the last because in the absence of any real medical certainty, that careful watching was often the only tool a family had. And perhaps this is the detail worth sitting with longest as we come to the heaviest part of this story. The brutality here was never loud. It did not announce itself with drama or spectacle. It moved through ordinary households in the quietest possible way, one day following another, one small change in a wound observed and discussed, and hoped over until either recovery came gradually and almost imperceptibly, or it did not. Entire families organized their lives around this rhythm of watching for days or sometimes weeks at a time, not knowing which outcome they were waiting for. It's worth remembering, sitting with all of this, that the very people enduring this uncertainty were in their own way still gathering the evidence that would eventually help end it. Every careful observation a mother made about her child's wound, every pattern a village healer noticed and passed on to the next generation, every physician's private note recording, which patients recovered and which did not. All of it was slowly accumulating toward a body of understanding no single person could see forming in their own lifetime. Somewhere within all of that patient unglamorous observation, the first real clues toward an answer were already quietly taking shape, waiting for someone willing to look at them differently than anyone had looked at them before. The clue, when it finally arrived, did not come from a laboratory or a breakthrough experiment or any of the grand moments we tend to imagine when we picture the birth of scientific discovery. It came from a young physician doing something almost embarrassingly simple. He counted. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working in the 1840s at the Vienna General Hospital, one of the largest and most respected teaching hospitals in Europe. He was assigned to the maternity division, which, as it happened, was organized in a way that would turn out to matter enormously, though no one at the time saw any particular significance in it. The hospital maintained 2 separate maternity clinics, admitting mothers essentially at random, alternating by day. The first clinic was staffed primarily by physicians and medical students training and working within the same building where autopsies were routinely performed each morning. The second clinic was staffed by midwives who had no involvement in autopsy work at all. What Semmelweis noticed, and what troubled him enough that he began keeping careful records, was a mortality rate in the first clinic, the one staffed by physicians and students, that was consistently and dramatically higher than in the second. In some recorded months, the difference was staggering. Mothers in the first clinic dying of childbed fever at rates several times higher than those in the second clinic, despite both groups of women arriving in broadly similar health and undergoing broadly similar deliveries. Word of this difference had in fact already spread beyond the hospital walls in an unsettling way. Women in Vienna reportedly begged sometimes on their knees to be admitted to the second clinic instead of the first, and some in genuine desperation chose to give birth in the streets outside the hospital rather than risk admission to the clinic with the higher death toll, a detail that historians researching this period have confirmed through surviving hospital correspondence from the time. Semmelweis could not explain the gap, and it consumed him in a way that colleagues at the time found somewhat difficult to understand. Why would 2 clinics within the same institution using broadly similar practices produce such radically different outcomes for the women in their care? He considered explanation after explanation, testing and discarding each one as the evidence failed to support it. It was not overcrowding, since the second clinic was, if anything, more crowded. It was not the position in which women gave birth, a theory he tested and ruled out directly. It was not even, as some colleagues suggested, some vague difference in the psychological temperament of physicians compared to midwives. The answer arrived when it finally did, through a personal tragedy that Semmelweis could not have anticipated and would spend the rest of his life unable to fully set aside. A close colleague and friend of his, a forensic pathologist named Jakob Kolečka, died after accidentally cutting his finger with a scalpel during an autopsy. What struck Semmelweis reading the details of his friend's final illness was how closely Kolečka's symptoms in his last days mirrored those of the women dying of childbed fever in his own clinic, the same fever, the same progression, the same grim pattern he had watched unfold in bed after bed on his own ward. This is the moment historians of medicine often return to as the true turning point, and it is worth sitting with why. Semmelweis realized with a clarity that must have been almost physically unsettling that the physicians and medical students in his clinic moved directly from performing autopsies each morning to examining labouring women each afternoon often, with nothing more than a cursory rinse of their hands between the two. The midwives in the second clinic, having no involvement in autopsy work at all, never carried whatever it was that these physicians were unknowingly carrying on their own hands from the bodies of the dead directly into the bodies of the living. He could not have known, not with any certainty available to medical science at the time, exactly what that invisible substance was. The language of germs, of bacteria, of microorganisms as a cause of disease would not be firmly established for at least another 2 decades. What Semmelweis had instead was something almost more remarkable, in its own way a conclusion built entirely from careful observation and honest reasoning, arrived at without the scientific tools that would later confirm he had been right. He proposed to his supervising physician and colleagues that some kind of unidentified matter, what he called cadaverous particles, was being transferred on the hands of physicians from the autopsy room to the maternity ward, and that this transfer was the direct cause of the deaths he had spent months documenting. His proposed solution was almost startling in its simplicity. He instituted a policy requiring physicians and medical students to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime, a strong disinfectant, before examining any patient in the maternity ward, particularly after leaving the autopsy room. The results, and this is the detail that ought to feel almost miraculous if you sit with it properly, were immediate and dramatic. Mortality in the first clinic, the one that had for years carried the darker reputation among the mothers of Vienna, fell sharply within a matter of months, in some records dropping from well above 10 in every 100 mothers to a small fraction of that figure, bringing it in line with the far safer second clinic for the first time in years. It's worth pausing here because this is the kind of moment that so much of history quietly turns on, and it deserves more weight than a single sentence can give it. A physician working entirely without the scientific understanding that would later explain why his solution worked, had nonetheless found it through nothing more than careful observation, honest grief over a friend's death, and a willingness to ask an uncomfortable question that implicated his own profession. Is there anything more human in the end than reasoning your way to a true and life-saving answer, while still not fully understanding the mechanism underneath it? The historical record is not entirely unanimous on every detail of how Semmelweis's findings were first received within his own hospital, and medical historians continue to debate the precise sequence of events and reactions in those first months. What does survive clearly across multiple independent sources is that the initial results were undeniable in their scale, and that at least some of his immediate colleagues recognized even at the time that something significant had occurred within their own wards. What makes this particular chapter so quietly remarkable, sitting here with the full weight of everything that came before it in this story, is how directly it connects back to every thread we have followed so far tonight. The honey that ancient healers trusted without understanding why, the vinegar that battlefield surgeons rinsed into wounds, the careful generational pattern recognition of mothers and midwives working entirely from observed outcome. All of it had been circling the same essential truth for centuries, that something invisible could move from one place to another and determine whether a wound healed or festered, whether a birth ended in recovery or grief. Semmelweis did not discover this truth from nothing. He was in a very real sense the person who finally had the right combination of data grief and stubbornness to see clearly what countless others before him had only sensed at the edges of their understanding. There is something else worth noticing here too, something easy to overlook in a story that can start to feel understandably like it belongs entirely to physicians and scientists. The mothers of Vienna, The ones who begged to be admitted to the safer clinic, the ones who chose to give birth in the street, rather than risk the first ward, were themselves part of the evidence that made this discovery possible. Their fear, born out of nothing more than careful observation of which of their friends and neighbours survived childbirth and which did not, was itself a form of data gathered informally across an entire city, long before any physician turned it into a formal record. Ordinary people had been noticing this pattern from the outside for years, before anyone inside the medical profession was willing to look at it directly. What should have followed by any reasonable measure was swift and widespread adoption of Semmelweis's hand-washing protocol across hospitals throughout Europe, a simple, inexpensive intervention that had already proven in careful and repeated fashion that it could save the lives of mothers by the thousands. Doctors could have washed their hands in chlorinated lime, and countless women who were about to die never would have. It sounds from where we sit now like it should have been the easiest and most obvious decision in the history of medicine. It was not. And the reasons why the particular combination of professional pride-wounded ego and genuine scientific uncertainty that stood between this simple proven solution and its widespread acceptance form. One of the more difficult and quietly heartbreaking chapters in the entire history of medicine, one that Semmelweis himself would live through and would not survive to see resolved. Is worth asking honestly and without judgment why an idea this simple, this well-documented, and this immediately effective would meet resistance at all. Doctors could have simply washed their hands and countless mothers would have lived. And yet the medical establishment of Vienna, and soon of Europe, more broadly responded to Semmelweis's findings not with gratitude but with a resistance that ranged from polite skepticism to open hostility, a response that has puzzled and troubled historians of medicine ever since. Part of the difficulty was structural woven into the scientific culture of the era, in ways that had little to do with any individual physician's character. Semmelweis had not identified the actual mechanism behind what he was seeing. He could point to the correlation clear and dramatic as it was between unwashed hands and maternal death, but he could not explain in terms that satisfied the scientific standards of his time precisely what was being transferred or how or why. Germ theory, the framework that would eventually make his findings make complete sense, was still years away from being established with any scientific authority. Asking his colleagues to accept his conclusion was in a very real sense asking them to accept a result without a mechanism and idea that unsettled the prevailing scientific instincts of the era. There was something else at work too, something less scientific and considerably more human. Semmelweis's findings carried an implication that very few physicians of his era were prepared to sit with, the implication that they themselves, through the simple unexamined habit of not washing their hands, had been personally responsible for the deaths of patients they had genuinely tried to save. This was not merely an uncomfortable scientific claim. It was to many of his contemporaries something closer to an accusation of guilt, and Semmelweis, whatever his scientific instinct, seems to have had very little skill or patience for delivering this kind of finding gently. Historical accounts describe him growing increasingly frustrated and confrontational as resistance mounted, writing open letters that directly and personally accused prominent physicians across Europe of what he called without much diplomatic softening murder by way of their refusal to adopt basic hand hygiene. It is difficult sitting here now with the full clarity of everything discovered, since not to feel a certain ache on his behalf. He was right. The evidence he'd gathered was significant enough that later generations would use it as one of the foundational case studies in the history of medical statistics, and yet his manner, his understandable but corrosive fury at watching mothers continue to die from a cause he had already identified and already proven solvable, seems to have made it easier for his colleagues to dismiss him as difficult, even unstable, rather than to sit with the deeper discomfort of what he was actually telling them. His professional standing declined steadily through the 1850s. He lost his position in Vienna and eventually returned to Hungary, where he continued practicing and continued advocating for hand-washing protocols, achieving real and documented success in reducing maternal mortality wherever his methods were actually followed. But the wider medical establishment across much of Europe remained largely unmoved, and the human cost of that resistance is almost too large to hold in the mind properly. Medical historians estimate, based on surviving hospital mortality records from across the region, during the decades following his discovery, that many thousands of mothers likely died from childbed fever in the years after Semmelweis had already demonstrated clearly and repeatedly exactly how to prevent it. The evidence here does not allow for a precise figure, and scholars continue to debate the full scope of this delayed adoption across different countries and hospital systems, but the broad shape of the tragedy is not in serious dispute. Semmelweis's own life ended in a manner that historians still discuss with a particular kind of sorrow. In 1865, showing signs of a serious decline in his mental health, possibly linked to what modern physicians reviewing the historical record now suspect may have been a form of dementia, though this diagnosis remains a matter of some retrospective debate among medical historians. He was committed to an asylum in Vienna. He died there just 2 weeks later, at the age of only 47, from an infected wound on his hand, one he had apparently sustained during a struggle with the asylum guards. There is a bitter, almost unbearable symmetry in this detail that historians of medicine have noted many times, since that the man who had identified the danger of untreated infection with such clarity and such cost to his own career and reputation should die from precisely that same danger, in circumstances that denied him the very care he had spent his career trying to secure for others. It would be easy, telling this part of the story, to let it settle into pure tragedy and leave it there. But that would not be entirely honest to what happened next, because Semmelweis's work, though it cost him nearly everything in his own lifetime, did not simply disappear with him. In the decades following his death, as other researchers working independently began to arrive at findings that pointed in the very same direction, the medical world slowly, unevenly, but genuinely began to reconsider what he had been trying to tell them all along. A French chemist working roughly during the same years, Semmelweis was fighting for recognition in Vienna, and Budapest was approaching an entirely different problem: the souring of wine and beer during fermentation, and finding through careful and rigorous experimentation something that would eventually connect directly back to everything Semmelweis had observed but could not fully explain. His name was Louis Pasteur, and his research, though it began in a wine cellar rather than a maternity ward, would go on to provide the missing mechanism that Semmelweis' own critics had insisted was necessary before they could accept his conclusions. What Pasteur was about to demonstrate through careful and repeatable scientific method was that living microorganisms, invisible to the naked eye but entirely real, were responsible for processes that people had spent centuries attributing to spontaneous transformation or bad air or simple bad luck. It was a finding that would ripple outward far beyond wine and beer, eventually reaching directly into hospital ward surgical theatres, and the very question that had haunted Semmelweis until his final days, the question of what exactly was moving unseen from one patient to another, and how it might finally be stopped for good. Pasteur's work in the wine cellars of France might seem at first glance an unlikely place for a revolution in surgical medicine to begin, but the connection once made would prove impossible to ignore. Working through a careful series of experiments in the late 1850s and into the following decade, Pasteur demonstrated something that ran directly against centuries of accepted belief: that fermentation and spoilage were not spontaneous processes arising from within the liquid itself, but were instead caused by living microorganisms invisible to the naked eye arriving from the surrounding air and multiplying within whatever they landed on. The experiment that settled the matter, elegant in its simplicity, involved nothing more complicated than a set of swan-necked flasks, their curved glass necks allowing air to pass through while trapping airborne particles before they could reach the liquid inside. Broth left in these flasks remained clear and unspoiled for extended periods, while broth left exposed to open air or air that had passed through a straight neck grew cloudy and contaminated within days. It was in its way a quiet and almost domestic kind of proof conducted with equipment a determined household chemist might have assembled, and yet it demolished a belief that had stood largely unchallenged since antiquity. What makes this moment particularly worth sitting with is how directly it answered the very question that had cost Ignaz Semmelweis his career, and in the end, very possibly his life. Pasteur had not set out to vindicate a disgraced Hungarian physician working an ocean of professional distance away in Budapest. He was solving a problem in fermentation, but the underlying mechanism he uncovered, invisible living organisms capable of travelling from one surface to another and multiplying wherever conditions allowed, was precisely the missing piece that Semmelweis's critics had insisted did not exist. The evidence does not indicate that Pasteur and Semmelweis ever corresponded directly, or that Pasteur was working with Semmelweis's specific findings in mind, and historians of science are careful to note that these two threads developed largely independently before converging in the wider scientific consciousness of the era. But converge they did, and the timing carries its own quiet, almost aching irony, since Semmelweis died in an asylum in 1865, only a few years before Pasteur's germ theory would have given the medical world every reason it claimed to need in order to finally take him seriously. It fell to a British surgeon working in Glasgow during the years immediately following Pasteur's key discoveries to carry this new understanding directly into the operating theatre, where it would finally begin to save lives on the scale that Semmelweis had always known was possible. His name was Joseph Lister, and unlike Semmelweis, whose findings arrived without a clear mechanism to support them, Lister had the considerable advantage of building his work directly on top of Pasteur's now well-established research into microorganisms. Lister's reasoning is in its own way wonderfully direct. If Pasteur was correct that living organisms in the air and on surfaces were responsible for the decay and spoilage of organic matter, then those same organisms landing in an open surgical wound might well be responsible for the gangrene and hospital disease that had haunted surgical wards for as long as anyone could remember. What was needed, Lister reasoned, was some way to kill these organisms before they could take hold, both on the surgeon's instruments and hands and within the wound itself. He settled on carbolic acid, a substance already in limited use as a treatment for foul-smelling sewage, as his primary weapon. Beginning in 1865, the same year, Semmelweis died. Lister began applying carbolic acid to surgical wounds, soaking dressings in it, spraying it into the air of the operating theatre itself during procedures, and requiring surgeons and their instruments to be treated with it before any operation began. The apparatus he eventually developed to mist carbolic acid continuously through the operating room during surgery struck many contemporary observers as almost theatrical, a fine chemical fog hanging over the surgical table, and it drew no small amount of skepticism and outright mockery from surgeons who considered the whole enterprise excessive, even faintly ridiculous. The results, though, proved difficult to dismiss for very long. In the surgical wards where Lister implemented his antiseptic protocol, mortality following the operations that had once carried a grim and well-known likelihood of fatal infection began to fall steadily and then dramatically. Compound fractures, injuries in which broken bone pierced through the skin, and which had for centuries carried a death sentence through infection, nearly as often as they carried hope of recovery, began healing at rates that would have seemed almost unbelievable to a surgeon working only a decade earlier. Lister published his findings carefully and repeatedly throughout the late 1860s and into the following decade. And unlike Semmelweis, he approached the medical establishment with a diplomatic patience that Semmelweis, worn down by years of being ignored, had simply not had left in him by the time his own evidence was strong enough to demand attention. There is a detail here that surprises many people the first time they learn it, and it says something quietly important about how slowly even well-proven scientific truth can travel through an established profession. Despite Lister's careful documentation and his relatively measured public presentation of his findings, adoption of antiseptic surgical practice remained far from universal for a full generation after his initial results were published. Some surgeons, particularly in parts of continental Europe and North America, resisted for reasons that echoed the same professional pride and skepticism of unproven mechanisms that had doomed Semmelweis' earlier efforts. Others adopted the practice only partially, misunderstanding key elements of the protocol in ways that limited its effectiveness, and in some documented cases allowed critics to point to disappointing results as evidence that the whole approach had been overstated. What ultimately tipped the balance more than any single publication or public demonstration was the simple accumulation of undeniable outcomes across enough hospitals and enough years that the pattern became impossible to argue away. By the 1880s, as germ theory itself became more firmly established through the continuing work of Pasteur and through the parallel research of the German physician Robert Koch, who developed rigorous methods for identifying specific bacteria responsible for specific diseases, the broader medical world finally began shifting in earnest toward the practices that Lister and before him Semmelweis had been quietly begging them to adopt for decades. The transformation, once it truly began to take hold, moved with a speed that stands in almost startling contrast to the decades of resistance that preceded it. Hospital mortality rates following surgery, which had for so long hovered at levels that would be considered catastrophic by any modern standard, began falling across Europe and North America through the final 2 decades of the 19th century. In some documented hospitals dropping from figures near 1 in 3 patients to figures closer to 1 in 20 within a single generation. Surgeons who had trained under the old assumptions, who had once worn a blood-stained apron as a mark of experience, found themselves often within their own working lifetimes adopting sterilized gowns, boiled instruments, and thoroughly washed hands as simply the basic, unremarkable requirements of their profession. Is it not a strange thing to sit with that an entire category of death, one that had shadowed human life since before recorded history, could begin to recede so significantly within the span of a single working career? A surgeon who began practicing in the 1860s, watching patient after patient succumb to hospital disease as an accepted and unavoidable cost of surgery itself, might by the time he retired in the early 1890s be operating in conditions where such deaths had become rare enough to draw genuine surprise and concern rather than resigned acceptance. None of this happened instantly, and it would be dishonest to suggest the danger simply vanished the moment Lister published his findings. The scholarly record shows a gradual uneven transition across different countries, different hospitals and different surgical specialties, with some regions and practices lagging considerably behind others for years after the core science was well established. But the direction of change, once it began in earnest, never reversed. For the first time in the entire span of human history, we've walked through tonight from ancient Egyptian wound dressings to medieval battlefield surgeons to the desperate mothers of Vienna. A wound, even a serious one, was beginning to stop being an automatic gamble with death. It was becoming slowly and then, with gathering speed, something a person could reasonably expect to survive. And yet, even as surgical antisepsis transformed the operating theatre, one enormous piece of this puzzle remained unsolved. Antiseptics like carbolic acid could kill bacteria on contact on skin, on instruments in open air, but they were often too harsh to use safely once an infection had already taken hold deep inside the body itself. The question of how to fight bacteria that had already spread beyond the reach of any external wash or dressing, an infection already circulating through the blood already established deep within living tissue, remained entirely unanswered, and would remain unanswered for several more decades until an accident in a London laboratory involving nothing more dramatic than a forgotten petri dish and an open window would finally begin to close that last remaining gap. London in the late summer of 1928 was not a city anyone would have associated with a turning point in the ancient struggle we have been tracing all night. Alexander Fleming. A Scottish bacteriologist working at St Mary's Hospital, was by most accounts of his colleagues a talented but somewhat untidy researcher, known for leaving cultures out on his laboratory bench longer than more careful scientists typically would. This particular habit, so easily framed as a flaw, turned out to matter enormously. Fleming had been growing cultures of Staphylococcus bacteria, the same broad family of organism responsible for a great many of the wound infections we have followed across every century of this story, from the ancient healers of Egypt to the surgical wards of 19th century Vienna. Returning from a holiday in early September, he began the ordinary task of clearing away old culture plates that had been left sitting on his bench for several weeks while he was away. One of these plates caught his attention before he could discard it. A patch of mould, blue-green and unremarkable, at first glance had grown on the surface, apparently drifting in through an open window, as spores of this particular mould are known to travel easily through ordinary air. What made Fleming pause was not the mould itself, but what surrounded it. In a clearing around the mould, the bacteria that should have covered the entire plate had simply failed to grow at all, as though something in the mould itself were actively preventing them from spreading anywhere near it. Fleming, to his considerable credit, did not simply discard the plate as an ordinary contamination, the kind every laboratory researcher encounters routinely and dismisses without a second thought. He recognized correctly that something in this particular mold appeared to be producing a substance capable of killing bacteria on contact. He identified the mold as belonging to the genus Penicillium, and he named the substance it was producing penicillin, publishing his findings the following year in a modest paper that at the time drew relatively little attention from the wider scientific community. This is a detail that surprises a great many people the first time they hear it, and it is worth sitting with honestly, since so much of how this story gets remembered in popular telling leaves it out entirely. Fleming did not, in 1928, transform penicillin into the medical breakthrough it would eventually become. He lacked the chemical expertise and the resources to purify the substance into something stable and usable as an actual medicine, and his own early attempts to interest other researchers in pursuing the work further met with limited enthusiasm. For roughly a decade, his discovery sat largely dormant, referenced occasionally in scientific literature, but not meaningfully developed a genuine breakthrough, waiting much like so many quiet observations throughout this story for the right combination of people and circumstance to carry it forward. That combination arrived at Oxford University in the final years of the 1930s in the form of a research team led by a pathologist named Howard Florey and a chemist named Ernst Chain, working together with a small group of colleagues under conditions that grew increasingly difficult as war spread across Europe. Florey and Chain took Fleming's largely forgotten observation and subjected it to the kind of rigorous, painstaking chemical work that Fleming himself had never had the resources to pursue, purifying penicillin into a form stable enough to actually test as a treatment, first in laboratory animals, and then with understandable caution in human patients. The scale of the challenge they faced is easy to underestimate from where we sit now in a world where antibiotics are manufactured by the ton. Producing even small quantities of usable penicillin in 1940 required an almost absurd amount of laboratory effort, growing the mold across hundreds of makeshift containers including, according to several well-documented accounts from the period, hospital bedpans pressed into service simply because nothing else in wartime Oxford was available in sufficient quantity. The team became so protective of their painstakingly extracted supply that they reportedly recovered and reprocessed penicillin from the urine of treated patients, since the human body excretes a significant portion of the drug unchanged, and every fraction of the substance they had worked so hard to produce felt too precious to waste. The first human patient to receive purified penicillin in February of 1941 was a policeman named Albert Alexander, who had developed a severe infection after being scratched by a rose thorn while gardening, an injury so small and so ordinary that it connects directly back to nearly everyone we've walked alongside throughout this entire story tonight. The infection had spread throughout his body, and he was by every measure available to his physicians dying. Given penicillin, his condition began improving almost immediately, a recovery so striking that it stunned the medical team treating him. But the supply Florian Chain had managed to produce was simply too limited to sustain a full course of treatment, and despite the team's desperate efforts to recover and reuse every possible fraction of the drug, the policeman's supply ran out before his infection was fully cleared, and he relapsed and died several weeks later. There is a particular kind of grief embedded in this detail that feels important to sit with rather than rush past. Here was proof undeniable and immediate that this substance could save a life that would otherwise certainly be lost, arriving alongside the equally undeniable proof that there simply was not yet enough of it in the entire world to finish the job. It is a strange, aching kind of milestone, a genuine breakthrough that still could not fully outrun the limitations of its own moment in history. What followed, though, moved with a speed that stands in remarkable contrast to nearly everything else we have traced across this story tonight. The urgency of wartime need, combined with growing scientific confidence in penicillin's effectiveness, drove a rapid mobilization of pharmaceutical production, particularly in the United States, where manufacturers worked through the early 1940s to scale up production from the handful of doses Florian Chain had painstakingly extracted in Oxford to quantities sufficient for treating wounded soldiers by the tens of thousands. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy in the summer of 1944, penicillin was available in sufficient quantity to treat wounded troops directly on the battlefield, a transformation that would have seemed almost unimaginable to a surgeon working only a single generation earlier, watching soldier after soldier succumb to infections that no antiseptic alone could fully prevent. Scholars and medical historians continue to debate precisely how many lives penicillin saved during the war years alone, since accurate record-keeping across multiple military medical systems during active conflict was understandably imperfect. But the broad consensus among historians of medicine holds that the number reaches well into the hundreds of thousands soldiers who would, in any earlier war we have touched on throughout this story, have joined the grim statistics of hospital gangrene and battlefield sepsis that claimed so many lives in the Crimean and American Civil Wars just decades earlier. What strikes me most, sitting with the full arc of this discovery, is how directly it closes a circle that opened many centuries and many parts of this story ago. Remember the mouldy bread packed into wounds by healers in ancient Serbia, and wartime Russia centuries before anyone understood what mold actually was, or why it sometimes seemed to help. Remember the honey, the vinegar, the careful generational trial and error of mothers and midwives working entirely from observed outcome. All of it had been circling, however imperfectly, toward the exact same truth that Fleming's neglected culture plate finally revealed in a clear and scientifically undeniable way, that certain living organisms produce substances capable of killing the very bacteria that had haunted human wounds since the beginning of recorded history. The ancient healers packing bread mould into an infected cut, and the Oxford researchers purifying penicillin from bedpans in 1940 were, In a sense, neither could have fully recognized reaching toward the same answer from opposite ends of an extraordinarily long and patient thread of human observation. Is there not something quietly remarkable in realizing that the final piece of this puzzle had, in some rough and unrefined form, been sitting in plain sight for the entirety of human history, waiting only for the right tools and the right moment to be properly understood? The years following the war saw antibiotics become with a speed that must have felt almost dizzying to physicians who had trained in the old world of hospital disease and helpless bedside vigils, an ordinary and expected part of medical care. Infections that had once carried a very real chance of death, the kind we have walked through together across nearly every part of this story tonight. The farmer's puncture wound, the blacksmith's burn, the mother's fever following childbirth became, within the span of a single generation, conditions a physician could treat with genuine and reasonable confidence. The gap between an ordinary injury and a mortal threat, the gap that had shaped so much of human vulnerability for thousands of years, closed more dramatically and more quickly in the middle decades of the 20th century than in all the centuries that came before it combined. This transformation did not happen without leaving its own quiet warnings behind, worth acknowledging honestly before we let this particular thread rest. Fleming himself, accepting the Nobel Prize in 1945 alongside Florian Chain for this discovery, used part of his acceptance address to caution that the very success of penicillin carried within it the seeds of a future problem that bacteria exposed to antibiotics in insufficient doses could over time develop resistance to them. It was a remarkably prescient warning delivered at the very height of the drug's triumph, and it remains even now one of the more sobering threads connected to this otherwise deeply hopeful chapter of the story. But that particular concern belongs to a different night, a different story altogether. What matters here, sitting together in the quiet as this long history draws toward its close, is simply this: the splinter that once could kill, the scraped knee that once demanded a mother's careful, frightened vigil through days and nights of uncertain waiting, the birth that once carried alongside its ordinary joy a genuine and unspoken fear of what might follow in the weeks after. All of it, across thousands of years and countless quiet households, was slowly, patiently moving toward this moment, toward a world where an ordinary wound could finally reliably simply heal. There is a museum in London, tucked into a quiet corner of St Mary's Hospital, where you can still see the very room where Alexander Fleming noticed that ring of cleared bacteria on his forgotten culture plate. It is a small room, an ordinary room really, with old wooden benches and glass instruments behind protective cases, the kind of place easy to walk past without realizing what happened inside it. And yet everything we have walked through together tonight, every splinter, every fever, every mother waiting through a long uncertain night, every quiet observation passed down through generations who never lived to see it proven right, somehow arrives at this one small unremarkable room. That is worth sitting with for a moment before we let this story rest. Because what we have really been tracing tonight is not simply the history of medicine, though. Medicine has certainly carried us through it. We've been tracing something closer to the shape of ordinary human vulnerability itself, and the astonishingly long patient effort it took to close even one small gap within it. A blacksmith's burn, a carpenter's splinter, a farmer's torn palm, a mother's fever in the days after bringing a child into the world. None of these were dramatic deaths, the kind history usually chooses to remember. They were quiet, common, almost invisible, and that is precisely what made them so enormous in their cumulative weight across so many centuries of human life. There is something worth noticing in how this particular danger was finally overcome too, because it did not happen the way we often imagine great historical turning points happening. There was no single dramatic battle, no sudden revelation that changed everything overnight. It happened through honey applied by hands that never knew why it worked, through mouldy bread pressed into a wound by a healer who had only ever learned it from watching her own mother do the same, through a grieving physician in Vienna who could not stop counting and would not stop asking why even when it cost him nearly everything he had, through a chemist in a wine cellar who was only trying to understand why bottles kept spoiling, through a surgeon in Glasgow willing to be mocked for the sake of a fine mist of carbolic acid hanging in his operating theatre, through an untidy laboratory bench in London, left alone just long enough for something extraordinary to grow on it by accident. None of these people working alone in their own small corner of this very long story could see the whole shape of what they were building. Each of them was simply following the thread in front of them as far as it would go, and then handing whatever they had found forward to whoever came next, whether they meant to or not. This is in the end one of the more quietly moving patterns in the whole of human history, not just this particular thread of it. Progress rarely announces itself. It rarely arrives as a single lightning strike of genius. It accumulates instead slowly, unevenly often, through people who never fully understood what they were contributing to, or who did not live to see their own small piece of it matter. The mothers of Vienna who begged to be admitted to the safer clinic were gathering evidence in their own desperate and entirely human way long before anyone called it evidence. The ancient Egyptian healers packing honey into a wound were conducting something very close to experiment centuries before anyone had a word for it. History so often remembered as the story of a handful of great names is really underneath all of that the story of countless ordinary people noticing small things and refusing to let them go. There is a particular kind of grace in that if you let yourself sit with it, because it means the people we have walked alongside tonight, the young woman peeling apples in a German farmhouse kitchen, the mothers holding vigil beside a feverish child, countless nameless healers whose careful observations never made it into any book were not simply victims of a world that did not yet understand them. They were in their own quiet and largely unrecognized way, part of the very effort that eventually solved it. Their attention mattered. Their careful watching mattered. Even when it could not save the person right in front of them, it was slowly, patiently building towards saving someone else, somewhere further down the long thread of time. We live now, most of us listening to this tonight, in a world so thoroughly shaped by that long effort that we rarely think about it at all. A scraped knee is an inconvenience. A kitchen cut is barely worth mentioning. This forgetting in its own strange way is a kind of monument, a sign of just how completely the danger was overcome that we no longer even feel the shape of what used to be there. But it is worth remembering every now and then, especially in the quiet hours like this one, how recent and how hard won that forgetting actually is. Somewhere not so very long ago in the full span of human history, someone very much like you was lying awake in a bed, very much like the one you are in right now, listening to someone they love breathing unevenly in the dark, wondering if the small wound on their hand was healing or was not, and having no way at all to know which. That waiting is over now. It ended quietly and unevenly over the span of less than 2 lifetimes closer to our own time than most people realize. Somewhere a policeman named Albert Alexander is still remembered faintly in old medical journals for a garden thorn that should never have been enough to end a life, and very nearly was. Somewhere in a small hospital room in London, a scientist once left a window open and something drifted in and everything changed. And somewhere further back than any of that in kitchens and forges and farmhouses that have long since fallen to dust, ordinary people kept trying. Anyway, not knowing if it would work, not knowing they were part of something larger than themselves, that is where we leave this story tonight. Not with an ending exactly, because it never really was one story. It was thousands of small ones folded quietly into each other across a very long night that has at last come to its morning. Rest now. The wound has healed. The house is quiet.